All right, so in this video, I'm going to be showing you how to utilize a tool in Unreal Engine called Texture Graph. So Texture Graph essentially allows you to take texture assets, manipulate them and merge them, and then export the output data into a new texture asset. So what I'm going to be using it for the purpose of this video, is to show you how to do channel packing all inside of Unreal Engine. So we're going to take multiple texture assets and then consolidate them into a smaller amount of texture assets. We'll be taking essentially 7 textures and merging them down into 3 textures that we can then use for a material that has a channel pack texture setup. Now, one of the reasons I'm showing you this is because there is now a new pipeline for getting texture sets from the Unreal Engine Marketplace, which is now called Fab. So you used to be able to do it from Quixel Megascans, and they actually had a couple tools for it. One of them was Quixel Bridge, which allowed you to view and then download assets directly from the tool itself. And another one that I used to use very often, especially for surface textures and things like that, things that I would use for landscapes or walls or whatever it was something called Quixel Mixer, which is now no longer supported. It's still functional, and if you have it installed, you can still utilize it, but you can no longer download any new assets through its library. You'd have to download the asset package from Fab and then manually import them. Even if you put the downloaded folder into its archive directory, it doesn't read it properly anymore. And I'm not sure how much longer Quixel will even be active to use, so I've kind of had to move on from it to do my channel packing. So I'm showing you this technique, and it also keeps everything consolidated inside of Unreal Engine, which is great. So what you want to do first is enable Texture Graph. So in order to do that, you're going to go to Edit and Plugins in your project, and then you're just going to search for Texture Graph. You can just start typing it and it'll show up. So Texture Graph here is what you want to enable, so you want to check that box, restart the editor. I've already got it enabled for the purposes of this video. And then you're going to want to create a texture graph asset. So what I've done in my project is I set up a folder called textures. Under that I have some subfolders. One of them is texture graph. Under that I have 2 folders. One is output and one is source. So source is going to contain the source textures for the asset that I'm going to be working with. In this case, it is going to be a medieval axe that is on the Unreal Engine Marketplace, which is now called Fab. And this is what the asset looks like. Now if I click on download, you'll see that it gives you multiple options to download this asset. Now all this is going to be different depending on the type of asset and everything like that. If you're only downloading like texture files, it's basically going to give you these options here. So what I did is I downloaded the raw file, right? Now the reason I selected this asset is because it does have a metallic value as well, which I wanted to use for the channel packing. Okay, so you want to download that, unzip the textures, and then unzip the mesh, and then you can bring the mesh in. Or if you want to, you can also just import the mesh directly into Unreal Engine using Fab, and then just replace its materials and textures after you've rechannel packed. But it's completely up to you. But I'm just using this for this example. So I'm going to close this. I'm going to go back into Unreal Engine here. And you can see these are the textures I've imported. Now, I didn't import a few of them that come in the zip, like a cavity map and a gloss map and stuff like that, because we're not going to be utilizing those. And then, since this is a raw asset, the original downloaded resolution was 8K, but I downres these to 4K just to keep things efficient and quick and all that stuff for the purposes of the video. So, now that we have the Texture Graph plugin enabled, what you want to do is right-click in your content browser. In this case, it's going to be my texture graph folder under my textures folder. I'm going to go under texture, and then I'm going to go in and create a texture graph, right? I'm just going to call this one TG example for the purposes of this video. And I always recommend saving. This is considered experimental, and I did notice a couple times when I used it, it was just very slow. The engine never crashed, but it does run slowly at times. And I think it also depends on the resolution of the textures and things like that. So I'm going to double click this to open up the Texture Graph editor. Once you open up the Texture Graph editor, you're greeted with this screen here. Now, as you can see, if I bring this down on the side, you have a bunch of different nodes that you can utilize in here, right? This is all laid out similarly to any of the other node-based systems in Unreal Engine. And if you right-click, you can also search for those nodes if you want. But the nodes we're going to be using for the purposes of this video all happen to be located right in here, which is great. Now you do start off with a single output node, which we'll get to in a minute. But what I want to do is start by bringing in a texture that we're going to be utilizing. So the very first thing we're going to be doing is taking the albedo texture and then merging it with the specular texture as well. So the specular is going to go in the alpha, and then the albedo will take up the RGB channels of the output texture. So what I'm going to do is, to start with, I'm going to utilize my resources texture. So if you watch any of my other videos, I always like to use very low-res blank textures as default. And then I create templates, and then from there it's easy to swap them out. So these are little 32 by 32 resolution textures. One of them is a blank normal. It is compressed as a normal and uses a default blank normal color. And then one is a blank white texture. This step is completely optional, but I'm just going to be doing it because it's my workflow. So I'm going to bring in the blank white texture here. And I'm going to call this one albedo. Okay, this will be my albedo texture. Then I'm going to duplicate this. And in order to rename, you can just hit F2. Or you can obviously right-click and do rename as well, but I prefer F2. And this will be my specular texture. Okay. So what I need to do, because my albedo already exists and it's already RGB, if I just plug it out into my output, it's not going to do what I want it to. And I obviously need to channel pack things. So the next thing I want to do is go in here and grab this node called Combine Channels. So I'm just going to grab this, drag it over. I'm going to pull this pin out straight into my output. In my output node, I'm also going to rename this. I'm going to call this one albedo S, EXP for export. The reason I'm doing this is because if you have any duplicate names, even if they're not the same type of node, it will add a _1 or a numeric value to it, which I don't want to do. So I'm just going to call this what the output texture will be, and then _export, just so there's not a duplicate name. Then under this output node, I'm also going to give it the file name that I want to export as. So I'm going to call this one battleaxe001 _albedo S, right? Now down here, you can also change the texture resolution. So let's say you're working with 8K textures, you want to downres them to 4K, or whatever it is, you can change those values here. I'm just going to leave it as auto. It'll just take the existing resolution of the input textures and use that. Everything else in here you can basically leave as is. The only other thing I'm going to change is my path. So I'm going to click on path and choose my export path. In this case, under texture graph, under my textures folder, I have an output folder. So I'm going to save that as the export directory. And now what I want to do, once again, as I mentioned before, this is an RGB channel, but I can't plug it in like this. If I just plug this into all the values, red, green, and blue, it's not going to come out looking right. You can see you have a preview here. So I don't want to do that. So I'm going to Alt and click to disconnect those. Specular, I can plug straight into my alpha. So I'm going to do that. So what I need to do here is actually split these color values, right? So I basically need to take those the RGB values that are already in there and then split them out. So I'm combining channels here, but I need to split the channels first. So I'm basically separating red, green, and blue, and then remerging red, green, and blue. So I'm going to take this split channels node over here and drag this in. Okay, so this basically does the opposite of this. So I'm going to import or input my albedo into the RGBA pin here, and then red, green, and blue will plug into those channels there, right? Okay. All right, so this is our setup for exporting our albedo and specular merged into one texture. So the specular channel will be merged into the alpha channel of the albedo. All right, so now is going to be our next one. So in this specific setup, and this is the channel packing method I use, the next texture will combine metallic, roughness, ambient occlusion, and height, or displacement, right? So the channel, or the texture itself is going to be called MRAH to represent that, metallic, roughness, ambient occlusion, and height. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to duplicate this node here. I'm going to rename this MRH EXP. I'm going to choose that output folder again. Now, even though I duplicated this node, it doesn't retain all those values, so you have to put it in again, which is kind of annoying, but it still makes things a little bit quicker without creating a new one. And then name on this, I'm just going to duplicate this same name up here, except for the suffix, which is now going to be RMAH, or MRAH, right? Okay, so all that is now good to go. Now another thing I'm going to do is go over here and I'm going to grab a color node and I'm going to call this one black. And we'll call this one white. Now, the reason I'm doing this is there are going to be occasions where there are certain pins that I will not utilize, but I still want those to have a color value in them that is the default color value. So if it's ambient occlusion, for example, it should be pure white. If it's metallic, it should be pure black. If there is no actual metallic or ambient occlusion texture value. Same thing for displacement, for example. Okay. All right, cool. So that is done. So now what I want to do is I'm going to duplicate this specular texture. And I'm going to make 4 copies of this. So there's going to be 3 duplicates. There's going to be 4 total. I'm going to line these up just to keep things clean. Okay, I'll put this right about here. All right, then I'm going to name these accordingly. So this will be metallic. This one will be roughness. This one will be our AO. And then this one will be our displacement. Okay. Now I'm going to make one more duplicate here. And this is going to be my normal texture. And we'll get to that one in just a second. I'm going to swap that out with the blank normal because it must be interpreted as a normal value. So the texture itself has to be set up as normal. And I'm going to duplicate this output here. And same thing, I'm going to rename this to normal exp. Now for this one, I also want to select the output directory. And I want to change the texture type to normal, so it knows that it's a normal map. And then I can plug this into here, and that one I can just set to the side. That one's already good to go. We don't have to do anything else with it. I'm going to save this. And then what I want to do is I'm going to merge these in to our specific channels. So I'm going to take this combined channels and I'm just going to duplicate it down. And then I'm going to plug in the values to the channels that I want to compress them into, right? So since this is RMAH, so it would be metallic, roughness, ambient occlusion, and height, right? So that is MRAH. And then I'm just going to kind of center this, bring this out here, and plug this in, right? So I can see what that looks like. Now, for this specific asset, there is no displacement value. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to plug this into white. If you're not using displacement, it doesn't really matter. I can plug it into black or white. And actually, in this case, I'll just plug it into black is fine. And once again, this is all set up now. I can just use this as a template. So I'm going to save this. Now, another thing to keep in mind is you can also disable this auto update. It can slow things down because it'll automatically update what the output looks like. But if you already know what you're doing or you have a template going, you don't really need that enabled. So I'm actually going to disable that. And then you can manually update here if you want to. Cool. Making sure everything there looks good. And I think we're good to go. So now what I want to do is bring in the actual textures I'm going to utilize. So what I recommend doing is setting it up the way that I did and then saving it as a template. And then you just go in and swap out the textures so you can just keep going through and merging them more efficiently. Right? So I'm going to go into my source folder that I have here, and then I have all of those textures that I want to be able to merge. So I'm going to take my albedo and do that. Now you can obviously drag this in if you want to, or you can select your texture map and then click this. It doesn't really matter. So albedo and specular are now brought in. I'm going to bring in my metalness, or whoops, not that one. Bring in my metallic value. I'm going to bring in my roughness value. I'm going to bring in my AO. And then displacement is going to remain empty because it doesn't have a value. One of the reasons I'm not keeping this just plugged in here is because the texture resolution of this is smaller as well. And we obviously don't want that to be the case. And then my normal map, I'm going to bring that in as well. Cool. So I'm going to save that. Now you'll see when I save it, it updates that texture resolution of what it's interpreting the texture resolution to be. So it's 4K. This one's still 32. And you can actually see over here in the preview that it shows me what the output textures look like, right? Cool. So now what I'm going to do is take all this and I'm going to export it. Now remember, we set our output paths here, right? So we have texture graph output in all of these. And then the only output node where we changed the texture type to normal was for the normal map, obviously. So once I go and do this, I'm going to hit export. And it's going to ask me which outputs I want to export. So you could only export a specific one if you want to. It's really up to you. And then I'm going to hit export because I have all of those selected. Then I'm going to go to output. And I'm going to look at my MRAH. Now, one thing you'll notice here is it is now showing blank. So something that I forgot to mention is when you're exporting and you're not utilizing the alpha for anything, you actually do want to disconnect it, because if the values are not actually a texture, it's going to give it an issue. So what I'm going to do in this case, I'm going to take this displacement, I'm going to plug it in just for the purposes of this example, and I'm just going to utilize the AO, right? So I'm going to plug the AO into my displacement because it's a similar type of a map visually. Okay, and then I'm going to export again. This time I'm only going to export the MRAH because that's the only one we modified. And now if I go and look at these, you can see my albedo S has an alpha channel, which is the specular, and then it has the actual albedo values here. Now keep in mind when you download these textures too from Fab that you utilize the base color texture and not the diffuse texture. The base color is going to be your albedo. It comes with the diffuse as well, which you do not want to use in this case. Okay. And then going in here, you have for the MRAH, this is your would be your height or displacement. In this case, I'm just utilizing the AO as an example. And then you have the ambient occlusion, you have the roughness, and then you have the metallic value, right? Cool. So we have all those exported. I am now going to save this. Now I'm going to go into my material instance for this axe, which I've already created. And I'm going to populate those textures. So I've already got my material instance or my material set up to utilize that specific channel packing that I just did. And obviously you'd want to take these textures and put them in the appropriate folder afterwards. So I'm going to go into textures. I'm just going to create a new folder here. We call this one props. I'm going to take the textures from that output folder and throw them into that props folder by dragging them over and clicking move here. And then in my material instance, I can go in and just populate those. Okay. And this material instance has already been applied to the mesh itself. So when I load up the mesh, you can see what that looks like. So this is utilizing the custom channel packing that I did and utilizing those textures that I just converted and channel packed. And I'll show you really quickly what my material setup looks like. So I'm using a material function, and these are my textures, right? So I have the albedo S, MRAH, and normal, and those are going into these output nodes as the function, so I can use it over and over, and then it's plugging into those corresponding values here. And there we go. All right, so once again, this is our node tree layout for everything that we just did. And hopefully you find this useful.